This is kind of one of my favorite questions right here. How does applied learning and learning through doing close skill gaps faster? I really think we should probably start off by defining what applied learning is.
Yeah, I love it. And I think it's so interesting to me because if you spend a bunch of time with folks who are in the academic side of the house, right, who are studying learning and adult learning theory and all of these things, there's a lot of research and data about how we learn. But in some ways, even prior to having technology to help us deliver learning, we had some really bad habits in the corporate world about learning. And part of it, honestly, was habits that we developed because it was convenient for scheduling. So think about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when you needed to learn something, what did you do? You went to a workshop. So you went away from your desk, you went to some space, whether it was in your organization or offsite, and you sat there with a bunch of your peers, and you probably got a big binder full of information, and you learned that thing in a classroom. And then what happened? You went back to your desk and your behavior didn't change. Nothing about your actual habits changed at all because we weren't connecting that learning to the work itself. And so then when we introduced technology to the process, I think what we did was we replicated that bad process. And we said, okay, well, let's just deliver content to people electronically instead of having to have them go away in the classroom. And somehow that will be better. And it wasn't better. So I want to talk about what good looks like for experiential or applied learning, first of all, and then we can sort of unpack how we do that. When we think about how we learn something new, and I always use the cocktail party analogy, right? If you walk into a cocktail party and you get introduced to someone and they say, hi, my name is Mary. And your first response is, oh, hi, Mary, what do you do? And they start telling you about what they do for a living. You've now lost their name. Their name is gone. And now you're embarrassed because you've completely forgotten their name. Why did you forget their name? Because it wasn't meaningful to you. You didn't apply it. You didn't use it. You didn't do anything with that data point. Now it's gone out of your head. The same thing is true about learning in our work, that if we learn something and don't use it, it goes away so fast because our brains are really efficient and they're like, nope, you don't need that. You're not using that. So we'll just let it go. So applied learning is about taking theory and doing something with it. And that something can be a wide range of activities. It might be talking about it in a learning community and saying, hey, I saw this thing. I've never tried it. Has anybody else tried it? What does it look like? It might be actually trying it and saying, okay, I'm going to try this new technique or this new process. And of course, most of the time, the first time you try something new, it goes horribly wrong, but you learn a lot about it when you're doing that. So that's what we mean by applied learning, is taking that theory, that fact, that tool, that technique, and actually doing it. And I use the head, heart, hands model when I'm talking about behavior change a lot of the time, that we need to know intellectually in our head what we're trying to do. We need to care why we actually need to do it differently, and then we need to do it. And that's when things start to stick. So that to me is what applied learning is really all about, is moving something from our head and our theoretical idea of how to do it to our hands of, let's try this, let's see what happens, let's find a way to make it stick and be meaningful to us.
You said a couple things there, Katie, that I kind of want to zoom in on. That old model of learning where you go off and you have a binder. I just had a flashback to like my ITIL certification course. I definitely had some huge books from that. But one benefit of that at the time was that my coworkers couldn't reach me, right? Like I could focus on that training at that time. But as you said, if you come back and you don't use it, maybe it wasn't so helpful after all. What can companies do to implement and maybe even measure applied learning if you're not coming away with, I went to this course for a week, I came back with a certificate, I can hang it, on my cue wall or my home wall now since we're all working from home? How can companies embrace that?
Let's start with, when we're trying to measure learning, what we're really trying to measure is behavior change. And so I think we beat around the bush on that all the time because that's hard. So when we're trying to measure learning, typically we use crude metrics to see whether people are consuming the content, whether they can pass a little quiz at the end, whether they enjoyed it, right? How many times have you taken an e-learning course and at the end of it, you get a little thing that says, hey, give this a rating, 5 stars. Those don't tell you whether that learning content was effective in helping you do something different, helping you learn a new skill. And so the first thing I would say that organizations need to do is think about how they're looking at measuring a learning experience. So if, for example, I wanted to learn a new programming language. Well, okay, the first thing that I need to do is go and potentially take a class or take some structured content to help me learn some of those skills and techniques. But then I need to be able to do it somewhere and use it somewhere. And the person who's actually closest to my ability to do that is my direct manager. And so this is where managers come in terms of being able to, whether it's team leaders directly, whether it's, you have a matrix management structure, right? Somewhere you have to be able to capture, hey, Katy learned this new thing, right? We hired her and she had these skills and now she has developed this new skill and I've seen her do it. And I've seen her progression over time, and I would rate her capability a 1, a 2, a 3, a 5, a 10, whatever, on that skill. That's an input that we don't always get. And it doesn't have to come from the manager. It can also come from a subject matter expert on the team. It can come from a colleague. It can come from a lot of different places. But that's meaningful data that helps us see progress. Another meaningful metric is business outcomes, which I talked about before. So just as an example, we've seen a lot of learning platforms be able to now do some integration with business platforms. So think about Salesforce. And if you have a team of salespeople and you have a learning intervention and you want to see if it actually improves the KPIs that those salespeople are measured on, well, you can do that if what you can do is see what it looked like before, right? What was their time to close beforehand, or what was their success rate beforehand? And then you have them take the learning intervention. And then you look at those KPIs again in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. And that at least starts to make a straight line. Now, it may not be the only factor, of course, because that learning intervention is one thing, but it's not everything. But what it means is that, first of all, companies need to be more intentional about those things. And then secondarily, they need to put more emphasis on the tools, the practices, the behaviors around doing that stuff. So building in time for people to learn, building in time and spaces for communities of practice to evolve and emerge, so that when I'm learning this new thing, I don't feel like I'm the only one that's doing it. I feel like I can call you up and say, hey, Rebecca, I'm trying to do this thing and you already know how to do it. Can you help me? That kind of communication is really important in terms of signaling as an organization that you have a learning culture.
You mentioned building in time for people to learn, and how like the direct manager is probably the best person to kind of see whether or not an employee has learned a new skill and if they're putting it into use. How can direct managers make that room for people to learn, or provide space for them to feel like psychologically safe to try something? Maybe it's a real project, but maybe it's also something like this, working in a sandbox to try those out before they start applying them to production environments.
So there's 2 things. First of all, one of the first questions that I ask when any organization comes to me and says, we're having trouble with skills development, I say, is it a performance metric? Do people have skills development goals that are being measured in a meaningful way? And the answer often is no, or yes, but it doesn't count for anything. So from how you get people to do stuff, if you don't care about it, if it doesn't count for anything, people do what they're being paid to do. They do what they're being measured on first. It doesn't mean they never do anything else. It just means they do those 2 things first. And the outcome of that is anything else gets deprioritized when something shows up on the doorstep that falls under those first 2 buckets. So when I say that managers need to make time, the first thing they need to do is make it a priority, because you can't allocate time to it unless it's defined as a priority. And then the second piece is we are really good organizationally at adding to people's plates. So I think most of us were hired with a job description. And like the first 6 months, we really felt like we had a reasonable set of goals and things to achieve. And then what happens? Well, Katie, while you're juggling chainsaws, can you also make soup? Katie, while you're juggling chainsaws and making soup, can you also go mow the lawn? Katie, while you're juggling chainsaws, making soup, mowing the lawn, can you also walk the dog? Right? That's how jobs evolve. And the problem is it becomes unsustainable. And we never go back and say, you know what, you don't have to juggle the chainsaws anymore. So part of what a manager needs to do is be really clear on what people are doing, how heavy their workload is, and intentionally remove or deprioritize things in order to create this space to do the things that are most important, to be able to know how to be successful and to be able to be inefficient at something while you're learning. So if it's going to take someone who's perfect at a skill an hour to do something, you're probably going to assume that it's going to take me, who's not yet perfect at that, 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours. But if you're still only allocating an hour for that task because that's how much time the expert takes to do it, you're not creating the space that people need to learn, and they're going to default to only doing the things they know how to do really, really well.
I do feel like juggling chainsaws is probably one of those things you have to be perfect at from the start, though.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot of room for personal injury in that example.
But that's a good example. You know, it's funny we joke about it, but when I talk about safe spaces to learn, a lot of times, like, let's think about an example of a company that's in the financial services industry. Now, if they have a value that says we fail and we learn from failure, oh, but if that failure is breaking compliance regulations or failing with your client's money, that's just not okay. And so the juggling chainsaws example, I think, is a space where, as managers, if I wanted to teach someone to juggle chainsaws, I might start out with having them juggle foam chainsaws that aren't running until they're really, really good at that before I would let them juggle a non-running regular chainsaw, or however you do it. But part of a manager's job, and you mentioned the idea of a sandbox before, is how do we create some defined spaces to fail safely and to say the consequence for this failure is not that we're going to lose our customers' money. It's not that we're going to end up on the front page of the New York Times, right? This is a safe place for you to take a risk. And then we build that tolerance up as people's skills develop in an aligned way. But I think sometimes that messaging around learning by failing comes without that caveat of, yes, but we have to do that safely.